Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Action Network's webinar on who voted for climate change or because of climate change. We're joined today by Bernard Rudney. He's a communications consultant, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. My name is Tika Newton. I'm the Domestic Policy Manager and Membership Manager here at CAN-Rac, and I'm really happy you're able to join us. We're also joined today by Amber Bennett. She's with the Climate Communications Hub, and she'll be introducing the webinar content. But first, I will just run you through some of the technical and logistical setup here with Zoom. So if you're not familiar with it, you can ask questions as we go. If you just hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button. You can click on that to ask questions. There's also a chat feature. You can feel free to post questions in there as well, and we will address them as we go along or at the end of the webinar when we have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm really happy you're able to join us. As I said, we're joined today by Bernard. So he's a strategic and communications consultant for the nonprofit sector. He spent most of the last decade focused on climate change, and prior to launching a consulting practice, he was the director of communications at the Pembina Institute. He's been involved in voter engagement and open data initiatives, including co-founding Open North and conducting field research for Elections Canada. We're really happy to be joined by Bernard today. We get to work with him often, and he's a brilliant strategist and communicator. So I'm going to hand it over to Amber now to just give us a quick overview of the webinar content and where this research has come from.
Thanks, Tika. So just quickly, I wanted to say that the Climate Communications Hub was a short-term pilot. So as we wind down and move on, we wanted to leave groups with an in-depth piece of data that could help inform some of your communications work or activities moving forward. And so Bernard has led that work, and I'll hand it over to him to unpack it for us. So thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks. So yeah, this is essentially, there's some data that's been gathered and trying to present an analysis to really understand how climate change played in this election. And, you know, it was interesting because there was both a lot of talk about climate change leading up to this federal election, and there was even talk about the amount of talk, which is usually indicative of something. So there was a narrative about how much this had mattered compared to previous times and the relevance of it. And that's not purely anecdotal. So this is just kind of grabbing some quick data as an example, but it's showing the percentage of newspaper articles that are, you know, stories discussing the election in basically every federal election in the last 20 years, and what percentage of them mention climate change. And you can see 2019 is very much kind of the outlier, the highest data point in that series. And, you know, 2008, which sticks out as a previous example for reference, would be when Stéphane Dion was running on the Green Shift as his platform. So we really have seen it kind of arrive at the point where essentially 1 in 7 newspaper stories about the election, and it's kind of in the 6-month window before it, is discussing this issue. And so I'm going to try and go through 3 questions, some of which may seem obvious, but it's really about kind of validating our intuitions and our sense of things against the data. And so one is, you know, what factors did influence voters in making their decisions? The second is, what influence did climate specifically have as an issue in that mix? And the third is some data that we've gathered to kind of have a sense of, okay, how do we move forward from here with the minority parliament that we're dealing with? And the data I'm presenting comes from 2 sources, both of which were sort of commissioned by the Climate Communications Hub. One is something, if I refer to the exit poll, it's a survey that was run by Polera of just over 5,000 Canadians, so adults who voted in the election. And this went into the field immediately after. As the election was on the Monday, it was in the field the week afterwards, data collected all by Friday. So you can't do an actual exit poll standing at voting stations in Canada, but this is kind of the next best thing. It's a survey that was conducted online, but all the results are kind of weighted and validated to essentially reflect the voting population. And it's based on the statistics that come from Elections Canada. The second piece I'm also going to give a bit of a preview of is there's something called the Canadian Election Study, which is kind of the gold standard for academic research on federal elections. It's run in every federal election since 1965. And 2 professors from the U of T and Ryerson have done an analysis on that data, so it's collected anyway, And they've got it from, they're looking at data from roughly 20,000 respondents for this purpose. And it's going to be looking at that and trying to unpack a little bit of some trends within voters, and you can look at it with a much more narrow focus. So both of these data sets are much larger than what you usually get in kind of the polls that are often reported in newspapers, and allows us to get a little bit more insight that way, because you're not dealing with just 1,000 people across the country. So to that first question of, what made voters decide? So why did they cast their ballots the way that they did? And I mean, the first thing that you can do fundamentally is ask, which is something that was done in the Polara piece. So, we had a question there simply like, what is the main reason that you voted for the party that you chose? And if you look at this pie chart, I'd kind of split it up as those two green slices are the people who really had sort of a strong positive feeling about it. So either they wanted that leader to be prime minister, or they wanted to see that party form a majority. Those blue segments are people who had some sort of softer sentiment. So either they wanted a party to win a minority or to play a role in a minority, or they were fundamentally driven by a specific platform commitment or an issue. And that last segment, that purple one, is kind of your pure quote unquote strategic voters. So people who were quite simply being brazen about that and just didn't want one of the other parties to get elected. It's an interesting breakdown because it kind of gives you a sense of what I describe as a bit of an enthusiasm gap in this election. It's a relatively, it's 40% of people roughly, or not even, who were really fundamentally driven by wanting to see a party or a leader win. Everyone else was kind of a little more calculating in that. And it's notable that within that group who said, I want the party I support to get a majority, that was heavily skewed towards conservatives. So, 85% of conservative voters wanted a conservative majority. But if you look at, for example, the liberal voters, that was only the case for 2/3 of them. So, roughly a quarter of liberal voters, for example, wanted a minority for that party. We also see this reflected when we ask, okay, how would you consider certain outcomes of the election to be acceptable or unacceptable? And we prompted with actually a lot more than what's on this slide, but I'm just kind of giving essentially the most popular options. And it's worth noting that none of the majority outcomes were viewed as acceptable by a majority of voters. So the most popular outcome was a liberal minority, which is what we ended up with, followed by an NDP minority. A liberal majority, which is the most popular of the majority options, was still viewed as unacceptable by more voters than acceptable. So again, it kind of speaks to that enthusiasm gap of there wasn't necessarily, as you see in some elections, a great deal of enthusiasm for one party to kind of be the victors on this. And one of the best ways to kind of unpack this dynamic is to talk about second choices. So we know how people voted, but you ask, okay, if not that party, who would have been number 2 for you? So this is for the electorate at large. So 4 out of 10 voters don't essentially have a second choice. They're committed to one party and we're firm on that. Beyond that, you can see the NDP sort of doing the best in there. What's notable on this and different from the past is actually that number for the conservatives. So it's essentially of the overall electorate, they would have pulled about 34% of the vote. Only 6% of people had them as a second choice, which is fairly low. And speaks a fair bit to the dynamic that we saw at the ballot box. So if we kind of break that down, this is the same notion, but going by voters of a specific party. And what you can kind of see is, so for example, among liberal supporters, 46%, the NDP was their second choice, the Greens for 14% of them, and so on. If you look at this dynamic, what you see fundamentally is there's an interplay between kind of voters who are of what I'm just going to, for shorthand, call left of center parties. It's not the best abbreviation, but liberal, NDP, and Green supporters who kind of switch back and forth between all of those. I've omitted the block just for brevity here, but there are some interesting dynamics with that. What's worth noting with all of those groups is, again, the conservatives are not the second choice for many of their supporters. And if we compare that to 2011, so that was the election when Stephen Harper won a majority, you're talking about that number's been cut in half or sometimes essentially even more. There's been a greater reduction in that. And that is a big part of fundamentally what we saw come out of this dynamic is Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives had a much kind of lower ceiling. They actually performed quite close to it, but there were not that many voters who were actually considering them as their next alternative. Leaders dynamics were a fairly big part of that. That's one thing that kind of Polar told us, looking at the data coming out of this. This is probably not news to anyone who's following the election or saw some polling from that before, but there were fairly high negative numbers for Justin Trudeau, but even more so for Andrew Scheer. So you actually had a majority of the electorate with an overall negative view of him. Essentially barely 30% who saw him positively. One of the stories of that campaign was Jagmeet Singh kind of building support and building popularity, especially at a personal level over the course of it. And he came out of it as the most popular federal leader. But one kind of key thing in opinion surveys is there's two ways to go about this question. So this one is kind of overall, what's your impression? So is it positive or negative? And you ask different gradients. But you can also just ask, who do you think would be the best prime minister? And those aren't necessarily, well, they're not synonymous data points. And if we look to that dimension, I'm just showing it for Trudeau, Scheer, and Singh here to keep things simple, but nationally, 36% of Canadians would have said Justin Trudeau makes the best PM, 32 for Andrew Scheer, and Jagmeet Singh, despite being much more popular in the overall, only gets about 1 in 5 on that. I'm showing this broken out regionally because I think one of the key dynamics here is essentially Ontario eastward, Justin Trudeau was seen as the best prime minister. All across the prairies, there's a clear lead for Andrew Scheer. And there's a reason this looks relatively comparable to sort of what you saw in vote shares in those regions. So that dynamic played quite strongly, and there's a pretty big regional cleavage in it that we will come back to after. To kind of sum all of this up, if you're just looking at the election from sort of a kind of political analyst level or pundit level that way, you know, this was a not extremely popular prime minister at this point going for re-election, but fundamentally the negatives of the Conservatives and specifically Andrew Scheer were a pretty definitive factor in the results that we did see. That brings us to, I think, the more interesting element of it, which is, okay, so what influence did climate change have within that dynamic? And to unpack that, what we did was test 41 different factors and ask people, okay, rate this on a scale of 0 to 10 of how much it influenced your vote. And those go everything from kind of big picture issues like the economy and healthcare, down to specific things that happened in this campaign. And that could be the climate strike, that could be sort of what happened with blackface and brownface photos of Trudeau. So it's testing across all of those items to try and get a sense of where they rank relative to each other. Because that's the key thing. If you just ask someone about one thing directly, you may get you can get 70% of people think that something is important, but the key question is, how is it as a driver relative to those other pieces? This word cloud is weighted that way. So you can kind of see climate change near the top there as, so it's large, it's relatively prominent, but it's not the most prominent. And we asked about climate change as one item, but also a number of other adjacent things. So environmental issues other than climate change were broken out to have that. Pipelines, including Trans Mountain, were a piece. The carbon tax was a separate piece as well, to try and actually see how those different elements worked and how they played out. This is, I apologize, it's a hard one to kind of read, but you don't need to go through all of it, but it's all of those 41 items in ranked order. So this is kind of the word cloud, but shown in a different way. I'm showing because essentially climate change is above average. You can see it highlighted in yellow there. People average it at about 6 out of 10 on that 0 to 10 scale, which means there are some others in the 7-point range that are more influential, things like affordability in this election, things like healthcare, which is always up there. So it's above the middle of the pack, but it's pretty fair to say based on how many people said they voted because of an issue, which wasn't an overwhelming thing, and where it landed, it wasn't sort of a definitive factor in this election for the electorate overall. The catch is averages are often a little bit deceiving, or at least they will mask certain trends. And that's the case with this one, where one way of looking at it is saying, okay, what's the average across Canada on that 10-point scale? It's often more informative to say, but all right, who actually felt quite strongly about this? So let's break out the people who rated any of these issues highly on that scale. So 7 to 10, that they said, yes, this was quite important to my vote. And if we do that, we find that climate was a top 5 issue for, again, what I'm calling left of center voters. So essentially voters who voted for the Liberals, the NDP, the Green Party, or the Bloc Québécois. And yeah, it ranked in the top 5 for all of them. And interestingly, it was the only issue that ranked in the top 5 for all of them. it doesn't necessarily pop as much in the national level because it scored very poorly among Conservative and People's Party of Canada voters. So we see a pattern there that, again, isn't maybe entirely surprising, but it's interesting because it's particularly active on this issue. There's other things like affordability or healthcare that will actually go across those lines much more. Ethics and accountability was something that got cited by every group except for Liberal voters, for example. This is one that really pops with that left of center segment. And another way of illustrating it, which is kind of one of the trends that pops out of this is, and this is a challenge, I think, in this election, climate change was one of, well, it was, yeah, essentially one of the most polarized issues in partisan terms. With that left of center group, it was the most polarized. So the way I'm just showing that here is saying, what's the difference between how many people in that group on the left care strongly about this versus voters for the Conservative or People's Party? And the best way I can kind of summarize this is climate change in the 2019 election looked like how you often see wedge social issues work. And there's been a lot of talk about, kind of in the postmortem, of Andrew Scheer's positions on issues like same-sex marriage, on issues like abortion rights, and how that was a signal or turned off a number of people. Climate was actually more polarized than either of those questions, and in that direction. And it's not what you usually see from kind of more middle of the road policy issues. It's very much operating in kind of the frame of like a values test or that type of dynamic. You could also see this skew on regional numbers if you break it out that way, but fundamentally it does come down to most strongly a partisan one. And if we talk about how that played out, we probably saw more discussion of climate plans specifically than I think ever before in a federal election. That wasn't accidental as well. I mean, there were, Andrew Scheer felt forced to unveil something in a very prominent way. He was being, called on that and attacked on that pretty consistently in question period for probably a year leading up to that point. So this is something that political parties did fundamentally seek to polarize heading into this context. And the same goes with carbon pricing on the other side of things. And so one thing we did have coming out of the survey data is you had 7 out of 10 Canadians who were essentially aware of the major parties' climate plans, which is fairly exceptional. You don't usually see that level of prominence. When we asked for those plans to be rated, you got to see the breakdown this way. The negative characterizations of the Conservative plan are relatively overwhelming to any of the other major parties. So we asked people, do you think this party's plan aims to do too much too fast? Is it about right, or too little too slowly? And you see 6 out of 10 Canadians in the too little too slowly column for the Conservatives. The Liberals are sitting in more of sort of a middle ground position, roughly a third in each camp. And the Greens were seen largely as, trying to do too much with their plan, which I think if you're actually familiar with sort of the targets and the science of it, can be troubling in certain respects. Again, on this one, averages don't tell the whole story. And that polarization we described was really fundamentally at play here. So on the Conservative plan particularly, it breaks down this way, where it was 81% of Conservatives thought that the plan was about right, that kind of middle of the road position, that it did enough. From all of those parties to the left of the Conservatives, you've got essentially 8 out of 10 voters in each of those groups characterizing that plan as inadequate. So that point did very much register in this election. And when we're talking about the sort of constellation of factors that pushed voters away from Andrew Scheer, or the reason that they had that very small amount of accessible vote, it's fair to say this fits into that space. So these are all higher level national numbers. The next thing I want to wade into a little bit is, well, what about specific ridings? Because fundamentally, we talk about it as one election, but you're dealing with 338 different smaller elections. These are some preliminary results, so I just ask, don't cite or circulate them yet because the numbers aren't final. The full results with finalized numbers will be shared. The 2 professors who are working on this are actually literally doing it as I speak. So what we can do, because they have a much larger data set, you can do an analysis where you say, okay, there are all these different factors that go into your decision. There's correlations between your choices in election, and it can be gender or income, or it can be your views on other issues. So what they're doing is a large-scale regression analysis where you say, all right, let's take everything in that mix build a model that maps that. And then we can ask this kind of counterfactual, like, okay, well, if we take the environmental items and essentially set people's preferences to 0 on that, what would that change? So if environmental views, if voters didn't have those, if they didn't have an effect, how does that map onto election outcomes? And what we get reinforces what I mentioned before. So that leftmost column is the actual share of the vote each party got nationally in this election. The column next to it is that hypothetical scenario, so that model outcome of what would it be without environmental views. And what you see fundamentally is, yes, it actually knocked a chunk of that kind of adjacent support off of the conservatives. And you saw that move in terms of kind of raw votes to the Liberals, the NDP, and the Green, and sort of roughly equal proportions, slight differences there. The Bloc kind of sits at 0, it nets out, and they're an interesting case because sort of fundamentally they are both, you could describe it as picking up votes on both the left and the right side of their kind of usual base of support. So they're able to pick up on some sides, but they're also actually competing with the conservatives for a number of voters in a number of parts of Quebec. So when you translate those numbers riding by riding into a number of seats, this is what you get. So again, the leftmost column is how many seats were won by each party. The rightmost one is if we cancel out environmental views, what happens? And I should mention the environmental views here. I think I skipped this before. It's climate as part of that, but it also covers some of it. So it includes carbon pricing, it includes views on sort of pipelines in the energy sector, and it includes environmental issues more broadly. So it's not purely climate change, but it's this kind of aggregate of environmental views, which tend to be fairly strongly correlated with each other. And you see, because this was quite a close election, this actually had a fair bit of impact. So you can point to 16 seats that the conservatives did not pick up, fundamentally because of the environmental views of voters. You'll see the Bloc comes out net down 2. And this is what I was talking about, those unusual, they're often in 3-way or even 4-way races with the Liberals, the Conservatives, and sometimes the NDP. So they actually, it shifted on both sides, where there were 5 seats in Quebec that the Liberals picked up off of the Bloc in this counterfactual, but then they picked up 3 from the Conservatives, again, because of that change in environmental views. Results from this with specific ridings will be shared, and you're also able to look at any riding, not just those ones that are model as changing hands. Just for now, I think it's fair to say, so like the environmental views of voters were decisive for about 21 MPs, and they're relevant beyond that. So that's just the ones where we can say this number of voters moved and that was bigger than the margin of victory for that MP. In an election this close, that's a fairly large number, but there are plenty more MPs where you can actually point to, okay, this many voters in your home riding were fundamentally driven by this. And when this data gets released in full, that's one of the values of it, is if you're meeting with an MP from a specific riding, you'll be able to have that and bring that to a meeting with you and talk to them about kind of their electorate locally and how that matters. And so that kind of takes us to the question of how do we move forward in sort of the minority government context that we have now. And so one thing in the exit poll that we prompted people with was, choose up to 4 words that describe how you feel about the outcome of the election. And so you'll see the top results: worried, resigned, optimistic than pessimistic. Overall, this skewed strongly negative. So 2/3 of respondents chose at least some kind of negative term. I think it was only 4 out of 10 chose at least something positive. You can see it pretty clearly. Not a lot of people are choosing inspired or proud or excited as the result of this. That very much was the feeling coming out of this one, and kind of speaks to the minority dynamics we were talking about before. We tested a whole bunch of different minority configurations that could be discussed. So, the Liberals negotiating support vote by vote from any different party, having sort of an agreement like you have in BC with the NDP or with the Bloc, or different configurations, having a formal coalition. And that sort of vote by vote scenario, which is sort of the way that you saw the Harper government go forward under minorities, was the most popular by far. So there's obviously sort of political strategy considerations to that, but I think they're probably not unfamiliar with this notion in terms of what we're going to sort of see coming next. Yeah, it's more popular than most of the more formal forms of cooperation. And it's worth noting that in most of Canada, there still is quite a bit of hostility. This probably isn't surprising to anyone who watched in 2008, to the notion of a government being propped up by the Bloc Québécois, or relying on them primarily for support for legislation. If we turn to the question of climate change, so we ask people, okay, do you think the new government should enact the policies they campaigned on in terms of climate, or should they do something stronger, kind of move quicker at a faster pace, or should they go a little more slowly and enact weaker policies? And for the Liberals, in terms of like going forward with either what they campaigned on or something stronger, that covers 2/3 of the electorate. And even among Liberal voters, 1/3 of them actually want the party to do more than what they put in their platform. So in terms of a signal for Canadians wanting ambition, that is quite strong. And there's another data point we have. You can ask about to what extent should this issue be a priority, and it maps on in a similar way. It's viewed generally as needing to be a high priority, and that's pretty consistent among voters who didn't go for either the Conservatives or the People's Party. We also tested a raft of specific policies. So these were drawing from things that had been articulated publicly by Singh Mayor Blanchet in terms of what might be required for support in a minority scenario. As you can see the results here. So we asked about sort of a large-scale jobs program that's in kind of clean jobs fundamentally. You can kind of think of this as trying to test for a Green New Deal, but without saying those words in the context of a poll. There's having stronger climate change targets. There's accountability measures around that. There's an item around just transition that explicitly mentions decreasing oil and gas production. And there's an item around ending fossil fuel subsidies. You can see those first 4 items all at least gain majority support in the electorate. There is definitely a pattern in those where there's more opposition to the ones that are talking about reductions to the oil and gas industry. And when you dig into that, it's a very strong regional split, fundamentally. So the only thing that has majority support across the country is the jobs program. Climate targets and legislation and accountability measures are already weaker in Alberta and Saskatchewan particularly, which may not be surprising given the political context. And once you start getting into items that talk about decreasing oil and gas production or ending subsidies, that actually loses a decent amount of support in the Atlantic as well. So the nice thing is overall, there's definitely items in here that it's possible to cooperate around and possible to build some consensus around. The sort of polarization and conversation we've been hearing about post-election, though, I think some of it, like the discussion of Wexit, is just the media needing a story, but there are fundamentally some deep roots to that. And it goes back to that dynamic of polarization I was talking about before, where it's voters to the left of center who fundamentally were motivated the most by climate change. And on the other side, the voters who actually cared the most about pipelines in this election were Conservative voters, and fundamentally Alberta and Saskatchewan voters. And that tension is still there and still relatively deep. So a couple of quick closing thoughts. I said this is mostly a recap to try and understand the election results. We're looking at a relatively stable minority configuration, and that's what voters wanted at this point. The thing I would kind of point out from past minorities is that tends to change after a few years. When there's kind of like posturing and negotiations and gamesmanship. We've seen this provincially, we've seen this federally. And yeah, people get tired of minority governments eventually, and parties who see a pathway to a majority actually tend to try and feed that dynamic actively. So there's probably more constructive things that can be done early rather than late. Second is that climate change was used effectively as a wedge issue. That's what happened in this campaign. That's why it looks much more like an issue like same-sex marriage or one of those divisive social ones that you've seen used that way in the past than more policy-oriented things. In an election where 22 ridings went by less than 1,000 votes, like that mattered. It absolutely had an impact. It wouldn't have changed the overall, order of parties or standing, but you can point to MPs for whom, the outcome would have been different based on this. It was the Liberals who actually gained the most on the climate issue. It was the Conservatives who lost the most. And whether accurately or not, the Liberals were able to position themselves, kind of regardless of the merits of that, as the right place for a lot of that support to go. I think the key question with a lot of that is, how to deal with that polarization outside of an election context. So I don't think polarization is always bad. I think sometimes it's actually extremely necessary. But with that decision point passed, there has to be a question of, okay, how can you chart a path forward that's not constantly bumping up against these dynamics? And with that, I will mention one last thing, which is, so this is kind of a presentation of results as, some of it was published by Clean Energy Canada for the exit poll. Some of it will still be coming from the CES data. The goal of all that is to be shared. So data files are available. You can contact Clean Energy Canada for that. And those riding specific results will be shared so that if that's something you're meeting with MPs and you want to be able to talk to that local dimension, that's something that will be available to you as well.
Thanks very much, Bernard. That was fantastic. There's so much data in there. It's such a rich data set. So we do have a couple of questions for you. If anybody else has questions, feel free to either post them in the chat or in the Q&A box. You can access that by hovering your cursor over the bottom of your screen. So Brittany had asked a question when you were presenting the sentiments, the words that people resonated with at the end of the election, with worried being 43%. The question was, but didn't everyone want a minority? So why are there such negative feelings about the outcome of the election if everybody actually wanted the outcome that we got? And you mentioned that in your last slide too.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't see questions as they were coming up. So sorry, I couldn't stop for that at the moment. I think I would actually go back to, there's that pie chart I showed at one point, which is, I would kind of put it there's 1 in 5 people who are explicitly strategic voting, who are just saying, I just want to keep party X out. But if you add that to the other, essentially, you end up with roughly 2/3 of people who are saying it's either that explicit calculus or they're not enthusiastic about any of the options available to them. So I think this is, if you look at that, it's fundamentally like fatigue with the government we have, but people not seeing a better feasible alternative. That would be my read of it.
Yeah. Okay, Rita has 2 questions for you. One is, where's the list of the 22 ridings that you referenced that changed based on environment? And can you just share the link for the report that you just provided?
Yeah, so for the 21, so that's the one piece where I said it's the one where that's still being finalized this week. So I'm kind of giving the preliminary ones on that. As soon as that's done, yeah, that'll be shared with everybody and it'll be the specific vote numbers. I just don't have, this is a preview, but I don't have the final one yet. So that'll be available through the hub soon. And for the link to the Clean Energy Canada one, I will try and dig that up if I can and put it in the chat.
If you can't find it really quickly, don't worry about it. We can also send that out afterward to the list and
good.
Directly to Rita as well. Amber asked, what surprised you the most?
I think for me, and it's a bit of a challenging one, it was fundamentally, that one I showed where it's kind of everything going from left to right. And it was the extent to, I'm not surprised that there's polarization around climate. We've seen that before. The fact that it was outpacing some of those social issues that we usually see, I think quite often cynically deployed by certain parties, is in Canadian politics historically, the middle is just always, it's this mushy middle kind of dynamic. That's often the safest place to be. And you'll see that play out in a bunch of questions. We're seeing this look much more like a values test. And it actually, when I look at this data compared to other stuff I've seen before, it looks almost American, which I don't think is necessarily a heartening thing, but where you're on either one side of this divide or the other side, and there isn't a lot of interplay between those two.
Yeah, I also find that a troubling outcome. I agree with you. There's a question here from Anne. What about the rural-urban divide? Is that conflated with other factors, or is that a real thing?
Yeah, so it is there. There's a rural-urban and there is a regional one. It tends to, the interesting thing is on the federal one, it gets outclassed by, how do I put it? There's a rural-urban divide. Disentangling that from the partisan divide is where that one gets kind of tricky. Because, so you will have, for example, rural Ontario that leans more towards the Conservatives. And it's kind of difficult to disentangle those two to a certain extent. From what I've seen, but I haven't been able to like fully dig into this one, it's like that partisanship dynamic fundamentally matters more on these things. And the rural urban divide on climate, like it does exist on a number of things. On climate, that one seems to be more reading as a partisan issue.
A question from Joy. One side had BC as a fairly evenly split province. Can you say more about the reasons? Why did BC vote the way it did?
So it's actually an interesting one where you're probably thinking it was like best PM, where that one actually had like a fairly even cut across Scheer, Singh, and Trudeau for Prime Minister. In BC, if you poke into those a little bit more, you do get a within BC regional dynamic. So that set, again, doesn't necessarily apply. It's not going to be even across the entire province. You're going to have basically 3 very different things happening on the island, in the lower mainland, and then in the interior. And BC is one of the places where the NDP has one of the bigger like blue-orange switcher populations, if that makes sense. So there's actually more like conservative to NDP switchers. It's there in certain parts of Ontario. That's where you see those dynamics the most. And so I think that's where, if you look at the numbers there, it's actually where Singh performed the best.
And Joy's pointing out that you didn't have Elizabeth May on that list of preferred leaders.
Yeah, so we did
that
have
might have been
her,
a factor in BC.
So we did actually test for all of them. I was just, with a bunch of these, struggling with how much you can fit on a slide at a given time. So yeah, we had her, same thing, like we have them for Blanchet, but I just didn't want to keep those numbers in there, or for Maxime Bernier, because no comment on him.
All right, so there are a couple of questions here about the degree of polarization and what polarization means going forward. So question from Anne, you alluded to the positive aspects of this degree of polarization. Please say more. And then Amber's got a question, a follow-up on what do you think the current polarization means for advocacy groups? Are there opportunities or cautions that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the positive aspects, I mean, I'm not unique in articulating this, but there's a pretty sort of long history of people pointing out in certain social change dynamics, you know, the notion of kind of like freezing an issue and polarizing it. So finding something that represents whatever you want to campaign on and using that to force people to take sides. So there's arguments to that, if you want to look at sort of like civil rights movement literature and all of those things, about that being an effective campaign tactic. I do think it's still a pretty challenging dynamic in terms of how it plays out in Canada, and especially regional divides and where that comes out. So it can be used very effectively on certain things. I think the challenge is that cut has become, it's not only where people stand on a certain issue, but it's becoming very kind of like values tied or identity tied. What that means for advocacy groups, I mean, like one key thing I would say from looking at this, and I remember talking about this with groups kind of like a year out heading into this election, is I think one of the challenges when you're doing the grassroots work or you're in an NGO is we're operating within a climate that is primarily set by, like, median political parties influence that much more. So what I was describing there in terms of like the characterizations of kind of the Liberals relentlessly going after Andrew Scheer for like, where's your climate plan? Where's your climate plan? Where's your climate plan? Created a fair bit of a narrative, and we are stuck operating within that. So I think it's one of those things, the polarization thing is often challenging to look at. I think you have to not carry the entire weight of it because we don't control that context entirely. Opportunities or cautions, I mean, my thinking on it is fundamentally there isn't one national thing that works for all of Canada in this sort of context. So you're not going to find an effective national message, I don't think. You're going to have to think much more about like, where can we narrowly find things that work? In a minority government context and in this parliament, that's not necessarily, that can actually be a fairly effective way to go about things. So I don't know that I think it's much more challenging if you're trying to find a campaign or something that resonates everywhere. But I think like taking those results when we have them to talk to specific MPs and seeing what you can push them on is probably where I would think there's a bit more opportunity for energy. I also think there's going to be a really key question of how the conservatives react to this. Like, they can see all of this as well. They are going to realize that this was a challenge for them. And it's going to be a question of if, as a party, they kind of double down on the path that they've had so far, which was kind of very much anti-carbon pricing and not offering a whole lot of policy in this space, or are they going to maybe try a different tack? There's one way of thinking about it that, if you think about where Canadian politics was 15 years ago, 20 years ago on same-sex marriage is a very different place from where it ended up. And not everyone in their party agrees with the positions that party's taken, but they kind of had a view of like, well, if we want to be mainstream acceptable, this is where we go. So I think they're going to be a fairly key factor in where this goes.
That's closely related to a question that Naomi just asked, which is, how do you think the conservatives' emphasis on a climate strategy might have changed over the election, like the development of a climate plan that became increasingly important?
Yeah, I mean, like, essentially it was like, because the way I like sum it up, you had to, like, in a nutshell, do the election results. It was people were dissatisfied with this government, but they really did not want or trust Andrew Scheer, is what those numbers speak to. I think it was the sort of like the climate plan was one piece of that. It's interesting in that it's the one that they most consistently lost ground on. So if you're looking across regions or you're looking across parties, there were specific other things that caused them a fair bit of trouble in Quebec, but maybe not elsewhere. There were certain things that, NDP supporters cared about, but Liberals didn't. This is something that was consistently a challenge for them for winning support from any other party. And hopefully that speaks to that question. I'm not sure if it did fully or not.
I think so. Are there any other questions? I think we've actually managed to get through all the ones that have been posted so far. So I'll just give it a moment here. Let anyone post any last thoughts if they have them. And if not, Bernard, that was such a good presentation, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all the final results. There's so much to dig into here, and so much that I think we can use to inform our ongoing work and our advocacy and campaigning. Maria does have a question for you. Did you segment by age? And Naomi's wondering about whether we're sharing the slideshow. So that's actually a good reminder to me. So we always record our webinars. This one, I think we are sharing to registered participants, but we will not be putting it live on our public on our website. So it'll be available to all of you because you've registered. So yes, we have the recording and you will get that. The slides.
I was gonna say, like,
no.
So because what I actually showed was like a short version. So in the link that I sent where there's kind of like the report, you can get, there's the thing that's on Clean Energy Canada's website has much more detail. So there's questions I didn't even go over here just for the purposes of time. There's a slide deck there that actually has more. In terms of age, that stuff is available. It would be in crosstabs. So Mariev, if you wanted to talk to Sarah from Clean Energy Canada, she'd be the best person to go to.
Kathleen's got a great question, one that I also had in mind. Given the stats, should green groups lobby for a green jobs transition bill?
I mean, how would I put this? I would not want to tell groups what they should or should not lobby for fundamentally. The thing I would point out from those items that we have at the end, though, is I would put much more emphasis on the green jobs part than the transition part. That's not going to be a surefire thing, and you're still going to run into a lot of these challenges, but that's essentially the piece of that is most popular. And I think that's maybe not surprising when you look at some of the framing you see coming out of the US on a Green New Deal as well, and by some groups here. Anytime, like, we tried introducing the transition away from oil and gas, that's where that essentially was a trigger for a lot of that negativity. But the notion of green jobs, I would lead with that in your framing.
Yep, that definitely echoes what we are hearing too in our conversations with labor groups and different people about the terminology that's used. Transition is frightening, and the idea of good green jobs is really inspiring and visionary. So I agree. Amber just posted Sarah's email there, so for anybody who didn't notice it, it's sarah@cleanenergycanada.org. So you can follow up with Sarah for the report and any other info.
Yeah, and I'll just mention again, the writing by writing stuff I think will be shared kind of proactively through the hub when it's available.
Great. Thanks so much. If there are no further questions or comments, I think we can wrap it up. So thanks so much again, Amber and Bernard, for joining us today. This was really great.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.